Thanks, Bilal, for that great opening talk. I will touch on some of the issues that Bilal brought up. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'll speak louder. I will touch on some of the issues that Bilal brought up as I make my way through this. And I will actually start off by saying I agree that something has definitely shifted. Since the 9/11 attacks in terms of what it means to be Muslim, from a Muslim background. In that, growing up, I also felt more, I guess, not marked is the right word, standing out more for my, ethnicity as an Arab, Lebanese, Syrian Arab, rather than being Muslim, and didn't feel that the way in which I experienced, the world or Australia as a non-white Australian had much or more to do with the religion of my family than it did with, the ethnicity. In fact, I felt that my experiences were very similar to my Greek friends and Italian friends and Vietnamese friends who are also, like me, had parents who had only recently came out. Or as in made their way to Australia, and definitely now the Muslimness takes a front seat, and the ethnicity resides way up the back. But what before I go further, I want to. The title, of this or of this evening, I guess, being Muslim in Australia. So, what even is a Muslim? Today, like, what does it mean to be a Muslim? Because obviously it's a religion. So to identify as a Muslim, to be considered a Muslim, is it only someone who is a 100% faithful adherent? Is it someone who prays 5 times a day, expresses their faith, and is as the most important a part of their identity? But then that also brings us into this tension of which Islam is the right Islam. Who can call themselves a Muslim? Even before we get into this tension between practicing, non-practicing, even between the various interpretations, because obviously for many, especially when you look at the increasing amount of people who were not born into a Muslim family who find the religion on their own and convert to it, in that instance, it is purely about faith. I do think, however, in this climate, this political climate at the moment, existing in the West, as someone who calls themselves a Muslim or is from a Muslim background is more than the faith, and often. Or part of that results as a fact, or from the fact that often we get defined, whether we're Muslim or any marginalised group, we often get defined by the mainstream, by the white society we exist in. So if you recall last year when Senator Sam Dastyari was on Q&A with Pauline Hanson, and he's described himself as a non-practicing or ex-Muslim, etc. And he's trying, to speak to her about the dangers of her proposed Muslim ban, and he's saying, you will be keeping out, you would have kept me out, right? Because you would have looked back, my birth certificate says I was born in Iran, born Muslim, I would be included in this blanket ban of yours. And of course the whole, that whole episode completely got out of hand, and it turned into, is Sam Dastyari deceiving us by calling himself Muslim when he no longer practices? What he was actually trying to say is, whether you practice or not, if you are born into this, it is a part of you, and whether you essentially want it to be or not. And speaking to that, I remember as a young backpacker many years ago, before 9/11, when I went to the Middle East, and I went to Israel and Palestine, and my passport, I was born in Tripoli, Muslim family, and the guides were shocked. They're like, what are you doing here? I'm like, well, I'm Australian. Look at my passport. And they're like, but you're Lebanese and you're Muslim. Like, what are you doing? Like, what have you come here? What are you going to do here? I'm like, at that point, I was kind of on the run from my background completely. Didn't want to know anything, didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so I'm like, no, Rock, really, I'm just a backpacker. I'm just traveling. I understand you have problems.
Is that a religion, backpacker?
Kind of, yeah. So that is, it is whether it's not really something you can totally, outrun, even if you wanted to. Regardless, whether you're a lapsed Muslim, a secular Muslim, or even if you want to disavow it altogether, if you happen to be born into it, as I was, this body that I have is an Arab body born in Tripoli, Lebanon, to Alawite Muslim parents, and that is going to affect how you move through this world. So I think in this political climate, to disregard, to say that, and this pressure and these accusations come from Muslims and non-Muslims alike, this idea that unless you are completely adherent and unless you observe it and you only put forward this public face of an observant, devout Muslim, then you can't call yourself a Muslim, because the pushback against Islam affects us all, in many ways, if we happen to be from that part of the world. And I think a lot of it stems from the way the West, or it all stems from the way the West has traditionally viewed the Muslim world and also the Arab world. I mean, I'm well aware that obviously not all Arabs are Muslim, and there are actually more non-Arab Muslims than there are Arab Muslims, but the two are inextricably linked, not only because Arabic is the language of the Quran and that's where it began, but also because the Middle East is where the location of the tensions between the West and the Muslims and Islam has been, not just in modern times, but stretching way back into history. So I'll just I'll backtrack a bit. Having said, I was born into an Alawite Muslim family. Now that is a very, very small sect, and I'm not going to get into the theology of it, because I don't know if any of you have read my work, but I don't argue and defend from theology. Like, I'm not interested in saying this Islam is right or Islam is the right religion and my Islam is better. We believe what we believe, and we are born into the culture and the families that we are born into, and we shouldn't have to defend. Like, we shouldn't have to defend our right to be who we are and what we are. And in essence, the hostility towards Islam has less to do with actual, the Islamic practice and theology than it does with the Western perceptions of what Islam and what Muslims are, as exhibited by the fact that prior to 9/11, our Muslimness wasn't made such a big issue of, and now suddenly it is. Now, coming from a very tiny minority, like a religion or an interpretation or a sect or whatever of, a really big religion. So what is it? 1.6 billion now Muslims. There's about 6 million Alawites. So like statistically, we don't even exist. But obviously we do exist, and we are part of that that tapestry. And so a lot of people assume, okay, well, the way you dress and you drink and etc., you must not be practicing at all. And it's true that I'm not. However, those are not. Those particular markers would not actually let you know, because the way that particular tradition developed, it shed a lot of the external markings of the faith for various reasons to do with persecution and living on the margins of society, and it turned inward a lot, and everything became so I guess. What's the word when you go to ground almost, so to the point now that only like the most initiated actually know all of the tenets of the faith. For everybody else, it's always been more of a cultural thing anyway. So I can always more speak about sort of the culture of belonging to a certain community. What I'm getting at with all that, it is leading somewhere, is that in many ways we fly under the radar, because we aren't visible, we aren't as vocal, and so a lot of the the more obvious pushback against Islam is obviously and unfortunately met by the visible women, especially. So we escape a lot of that, but in other ways we then get erased. We then get being people either not knowing we exist, or when they do know and we speak up, it's like, well, you're not really Muslim because they all drink and they do this and they don't pray 5 times a day and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and what I want to say is, I think it's very important that we accept that as part of the Muslim world, not just in terms of accepting the people from that background and other traditions that are similarly a little bit more, I guess what you'd call liberal, but I don't necessarily think that's the right word, but because that is part of the tapestry of Islam, and it shows the extent of how diverse Islam is, because what the West is happening and likes to do is to sort of narrow the scope of it, more and more till you get to this, to basically, the fundamentalism, as if that is the real religion, the real expression of the religion. So you'll often see a lot of, well, ISIS is the true, they're really following, the teachings and, in the Quran. And so I think it's vital to, acknowledge that these traditions, which might seem liberal only because they're different to other expressions of the faith, are authentically Muslim in that they developed in the Muslim world. And so what I'm getting at here is I feel a lot of pressure to say, well, why don't you just say you're not Muslim? Like, you say you're not practicing and you don't do this and you don't do that. Because I feel, unfortunately, that we're in this competition, right? So in a way, it's like they're trying to get me to say, just admit that the West is better. Just admit that, and I'm very resistant to that because I'm not ashamed of being, a Muslim, and that not just for the particular community I come from, but the whole of it, the whole history of Islam, the history of the literature and the philosophy and the science and the art that exists and has always existed, and which unfortunately is now, being not only eroded but being forgotten because of the violence and the tensions that exist. So, vital to look at all these different expressions of it, but at the same time, our existence and the existence of so many different sects and subsects and schools and interpretations, it shows that this narrow idea of what Islam is it's a new thing. It's a modern thing, like the rise of Wahhabism. And if we want to look at what it means to be Muslim in Australia and all of the burdens that come with it, we have to look at what's the source of a lot of these conflicts here, which is in the Middle East primarily, and that is how the West, so the West broadens its understandings of the Muslim world and the Arab world, so that it's beyond, the face veils and the belly dancing and the terrorism and the bloodthirsty dictators and all of these, cliches and stereotypes. It's going to, continue to identify Islam only by, the strictest interpretation, which is not the traditional or even the mainstream, even though it is starting to sweep across the many Muslim and majority countries. And by doing that, by sort of trying to just locate and identify only the actual the violent expressions, or by people who use the religion to further their agenda, it's not giving other Muslims the space to develop and to grow and to be themselves. And the most frustrating thing for me is the quickness to blame the religion any time violence does flare up, and the way that the West itself is absolved of any of the conflicts, the violence, etc. And if you want to look at the West's role, you only have to look at this alliance that it has with Saudi Arabia, known to be one of the most, or if not the most, repressive countries, governments in the world, and yet it's our second best ally outside of Israel in the Middle East. And just last year, Australia joined Germany, Sweden, the UK, the US in selling arms to Saudi Arabia in the middle of its war on Yemen, destroying the poorest Middle Eastern country right next door. And then at the same time, we have the nerve whenever a female foreign dignitary goes to Saudi Arabia, just like Angela Merkel did, and she didn't wear the hijab, and it's like, well, she's defying the laws. It's like, well, no, first of all, the law does not apply to her. They're not interested in oppressing the people that make their repression possible. And also, you're selling weapons to them. You cannot... you can't separate that. You can't separate the role that you've had in allowing this oppression and violence to flourish, and then stand back and say, "Oh, if only they knew what women could do." Another, a consequence of that is not only does this oppression continue, but the trust that Arabs and Muslims in that part of the world have of the West just gets continuously more eroded. It's quite offensive to talk about defying these so-called laws that don't apply to you when the people that are affected by them have no choice, and they're well aware of the fact that you're helping that oppression to continue. So, it's not only this funding of, or this alliance with Saudi Arabia, of course, it's also the funding of particular insurgent groups. We'll fund them, and we'll fund this dictator to get rid of that enemy, and then it just creates another enemy, and then it all just spreads and spreads. And then when the attacks spread to the West, as it's inevitably they're going to do, who gets blamed? The average, ordinary Muslims just trying to live their life here. It's just so completely unfair on so many levels. You have the Muslims in the conflict-ridden parts of the world who suffer, and then you have the Muslims who get blamed for what is essentially an alliance between Western powers and repressive Middle Eastern powers and insurgent want-to-be powers. And so until we acknowledge that, then it is going to continue to be almost impossible to be a Muslim in Australia and in the West. And until we acknowledge that this fundamentalism and violence that is is practiced or is justified or rationalized by some Muslim groups and some Muslim governments is not the whole and entirety of Islam. And in fact, it was, just as fundamentalism exists in every ideology and in every religion, it exists in Islam. However, instead of being allowed to be neutralized and remain on the fringes, it was allowed to flourish, and it was funded by Western powers, yes, and at the same time that other movements, the liberal Muslim movements or the mainstream Muslim movements, the secular movements, the communists and the socialists and the Arab nationalists and the feminists, all of that was squashed. And obviously all that can rise then is this small kernel of fundamentalism, which now unfortunately people assume to be the entire religion. And until we own up to that, and it's not entirely the West's fault, of course not. They have to have people there to work with. There is this alliance going on, and until we can see that is what's happening, it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And all Muslims, whether we're visible or not, whether we're practicing or not, whether we are devout or we are lapsed or ex-Muslim, by virtue of the fact that we are associated with it, and then we're wondering, where's it going to end? At what point are we going to not be allowed on planes anymore? This is a real thought that's gone through my head. Like, we can giggle and laugh about it, and sometimes I feel ridiculous for thinking that, but other times I think it could be a possibility. They're not going to care. I can stand there and say, well, when we're Alawites and we don't do terrorism, and also I'm not even practicing, and look, I've got alcohol, I'm one of you. Like, I can say that, but my name and the place I was born, bang, you're gone. That you are with them. That's it. And none of that is going to save us. So we are as all Muslims, whether we're converts or practicing, non-practicing, are in this together, but at the same time, as a global society, we're in this together, because I can tell you these attacks, terrorist attacks, whatever you want to call them, lone wolf attacks in the West, are not going to stop until we acknowledge what is actually behind them. That's it. Thank you.